The 2024 election cycle is unprecedented in so many ways. What started as a mere rematch of the same camps we saw 4 years ago has culminated in an attempted assassination, a sudden resignation, and a complete upheaval of one ticket. But one city is bracing to feel those changes more than any other in the coming weeks: Chicago. As the host city for the Democratic National Convention, Chicago will make history when delegates officially name a new nominee in place of the party's sitting president. Here's what's crazy though. It's not the first time Chicago has done that. The same thing happened in this same city in 1968. In part 1, we told you all about the ways Chicago has changed since it won the bid for this convention. But more recently, the changes on the national stage have been even more significant. In this video, we'll take a look at how each development has made this election cycle more and more like 1968. Now Chicago has a choice: repeat its past or redeem its legacy. Let's compare. The similarities between these two election cycles are uncanny. Both years saw an incumbent president drop out of the race despite winning primaries. Both years had an international conflict driving civil unrest. Both years had a Robert F. Kennedy running against their party's sitting president, like father, like son. And both saw an assassination attempt, though tragically, in 1968, the plot against Mr. Kennedy was successful. So how did those events affect the convention that year? Is there anything we can learn about it going into August 2024? Let's take a look. It was late March in the '68 campaign, nearly 5 months out from the convention, when incumbent President Lyndon B. Johnson stepped out of the race. His approval rating at the time was 36%. If you're curious, Biden's in July was 39%, and by the time the convention rolled around, there were still 2 candidates who were top contenders to take his place: Vice President Hubert Humphrey and Senator Eugene McCarthy. Humphrey had LBJ's endorsement, and delegates from states he'd won before dropping out agreed to back him. However, McCarthy's supporters felt Humphrey didn't do enough to oppose the war in Vietnam. They said if Johnson couldn't win, neither could Humphrey, and they believed the delegates from those states should go to runner-up McCarthy. This debate drew thousands of protesters to Chicago, especially those who opposed the war. The situation was tense but non-violent until 17-year-old hippie Dean Johnson pulled a gun on police. It misfired, but he was killed by return fire, and from there, things went south. Dean Johnson was the only casualty in the riots, but hundreds were injured, mostly protesters, plus a few police and several bystanders caught in the middle. Clashes popped up all over the city, ranging from the convention itself at the International Amphitheater on the south side, to Grant Park and Michigan Avenue, and as far north as Lincoln Park. Earlier that year, Chicago had seen other deadly riots following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., during which Mayor Richard J. Daley gave the alarming and infamous order for police to shoot to kill arsonists and shoot to maim looters. Federal investigators looking into the chaos of the convention eventually described the violence as a, quote, police riot, possibly spurred on by this earlier rhetoric from the mayor. Now, that was not the last time Chicago hosted a DNC. The city also ran a very successful 1996 convention that certainly restored a little dignity. But as you may have noticed, the atmosphere leading up to 2024 feels a lot more like '68 than '96. At first, the biggest sign this year would not turn into a repeat was the nomination itself. For most of the campaign, no one in the Democratic camp anticipated a fight for the nomination, until...
with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden.
For the longest time, Biden resisted calls for him to step down. But after a polling surge for Donald Trump following his assassination attempt and rumors of significant pressure from party insiders, Biden posted his resignation letter on X. With just a month to the convention, the campaign started over. The good news for Chicago is that there seems to be little intra-party opposition to Kamala Harris taking over the campaign. Delegates from states that voted for Biden in the primary, all of them, are not bound to follow his endorsement now that he's dropped out. They could have supported anyone they wanted, technically. The fact that most have already pledged themselves to a Harris ticket is a good sign for Chicago. At the time of this recording, there seems to be little to no infighting for the 2024 nomination, which was one of the main drivers of conflict in '68. So with all this history to inform us, what is Chicago doing to ensure safety at the convention? What is the actual plan? As if the national tensions weren't enough to manage, we already know of multiple radical leftist groups here in the city planning protests for the convention regardless of the nominee. And as we discussed in part 1, not all of them are committed to doing so peacefully. So how will the city respond? Well, the official stance of today's mayor is obviously much gentler than in 1968. Nobody wants another police riot, least of all Mayor Brandon Johnson, who again was described by Politico as, quote, unabashedly sympathizing with protesters. But there are some concerns about whether the city is planning to do enough. When the city first announced their plans, it included protocol for mass arrests. But then, after public pushback, they said they won't be allowing mass arrests. Another concern is the convention perimeter. Before the final plan was even announced, some of these protest groups drafted a lawsuit accusing the city of not letting them close enough to the convention center. It remains to be seen whether that lawsuit will have an effect on the plan. And finally, some information that should probably be public is still being kept in the dark. NBC says the city improperly denied its FOIA request around protest permits. They wanted to see which groups have applied and whether those applications have been approved or rejected, but they were denied. Remember, several groups with violent rhetoric have already committed to showing up even if their permits are denied. Having that information could help residents and business owners in the surrounding neighborhoods prepare. But the biggest concern may not be the plan itself, but the ability to execute it. The Chicago Police Department is understaffed by nearly 2,000 officers, according to Chief Snelling. No amount of planning can make up for that kind of manpower shortage. Last year, the department spent $293 million in police overtime. The DNC could potentially increase that. But of course, this concern isn't just about money, it's making sure the officers aren't overworked or spread too thin.
The police, overwrought, were easily triggered.
Even without a major political event, the department sometimes has trouble responding to daily 911 calls. In the first 9 months of 2023, some 225,000 priority calls in the city never got any response. So Chicagoans should keep their eyes open when the convention is in town. Right now, 1968 is remembered as the most turbulent national convention in either party's history. But there are certain groups openly declaring it their goal to challenge that this year. Cooler heads and decisive leadership are needed to keep the city safe this August. One more interesting thing about this convention. For all the calls for rioting, all the vague security promises, and all the last-minute breaking developments, it's still possible there might not even be a nomination. See, when the Democrats first asked for a later convention date than usual, they overlooked Ohio. Ohio's deadline to name a nominee was earlier than the convention itself, but rather than change the convention dates, the party's solution was to hold a virtual nomination online ahead of time. Now, since then, Ohio has changed its deadline. The party could go back to in-person voting at the convention if they need to, say if anyone challenges Kamala Harris last minute. But at least as of this recording, the DNC has not announced any plans to cancel the virtual vote, meaning all this stress, all these worries, and any potential disruptions coming to Chicago may be for the sake of a show nomination. Pomp and circumstance. But whether the vote is live in Chicago or over the internet, by the end of August, a lot of questions will be answered. America will have its final presidential candidate set, and the world will know a lot more about the Democratic Party and the city that's been its most loyal adherent.